Today, my guest, once again, we welcome back Emeritus Professor of Politics at Ilan University and founder and president of NGO Monitor, which monitors the non-governmental organizations that are active in Israel. Gerald Steinberg, welcome back. Welcome back. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to be
Thank
back.
you. Thank
We've
you.
done this for a lot of time. Many
Yes,
years.
yes. And we have a lot to talk about. A lot has gone on since we last spoke. And I mean, and by the way, we're recording this on the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And of course, the Nazis had one goal, wipe out all the Jews, and Hamas has one goal, wipe out the Jews. The more we live, the more we have people who want to just wipe out the Jews. And so how are we doing with the Hamas? What's happening with
Well,
it?
let's look at it from different perspectives. One of the biggest differences, and I say this all the time when people are upset and depressed, is we have a country, we have a state, we have an army, we're fighting back, and we're doing, I think, as a country, under the circumstances, a very good job. The soldiers really, with a lot of, in Hebrew you say, mesirot nefesh, they're willing to put everything they have into preserving the country and defending the country. And a lot of the divisions that you see and you hear, the political divisions, they disappear in the army. And there's a lot of sense of we got to go through this. It's a rough time because now we're starting to see, in a good sense, some of the hostages coming back. We had 7 young women that came back, and there are supposed to be another, I think, about 20 or so that are supposed to come back alive, and I think 7 or 8 bodies are, we were told, coming back as dead. But that's the first phase, and there are another 60 or so that are waiting. And so we have a long way to go with this, and being forced to pull back from the accomplishments in Gaza, allowing the not just millions of people, or 1.5 million, maybe 1.5, 7 million, but they're all embedded with Hamas. And there's no way to distinguish between them if you're not on the ground and you're not fighting. And that's a very difficult decision. And many Israelis are, some are very critical, others are very nervous about this. Where is that going to leave us in when the hostage exchange is over, hopefully, and everybody comes back, and will Hamas just rebuild? But we have to have the sense of we can do this. We won't allow ourselves to be caught the way we were caught before October 7th. And I won't say it's trivial, but I think that there's reason to be cautiously optimistic, looking at what the geopolitical map of where we are now and where we're likely to be in the future.
Yes, the geopolitical map. That's Israel in 1 year has accomplished quite a bit in terms of what Iran had built up over many, many years. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I wanted to ask you, when we saw a prisoner exchange recently, we saw Hamas dressed in Hamas uniforms, and they don't fight they're in civilian clothes. So that was quite a staged event, and I understand Qatar was quite upset about that.
Well, I'm not going to get into the Qatar issue because they're just rumors, and rumors are designed for certain purposes. Qatar tries to present itself as straddling both fences, but they're the major supporters for Hamas across the board. Their Muslim Brotherhood, the regime there, the Emir and everybody else that's there, they fund a lot of the organizations. Look, in New York, you've got groups like Students for Justice in Palestine,
Yeah.
and many other versions of that, and Semidun, and so many other of these groups. And it looks like Qatar is behind a lot of that. Certainly Al Jazeera, which is a very poisonous, they call themselves journalists. They're a poisonous propaganda group and various spin-offs. And then in the world that I deal a lot with of NGOs, and you have American registered non-governmental organizations, sort of like charities that get IRS deductions. And there are lots of connections between a number of them in Qatar, including using their platforms and perhaps funding, because the funding is secret. So I think that's a side comment to your question, but I want to put that on the table. I think there has to be a lot more skepticism. I know that all the negotiators, both Blinken and now Steve Witkoff, are telling us how wonderful the Qataris are. If it wasn't for Qatar, we wouldn't have all this power that Hamas and the ability to survive. So I'd be cautious about that. There are a lot more questions to be asked as we go through this step by step.
Right, but that was quite a show that they put on.
The show
Uh,
that they put on, they are for Hamas and for all the Palestinians, the show is in many ways very much part of their strategy. So even though they only had, let's say, 100, 150 people with the headbands and looking like they were Hamas people, that's all they needed because that was the show. And they were taunting and they were ridiculing, they were humiliating the Israeli hostages, the young women. And that was what this was all about. You know, they gave them certificates of completion of their sentence, like they were prisoners who were accused and found guilty of a crime in a court. And then you had the Red Cross signing these certificates. The
oh, did
United
they
States
sign it?
gives
Well, what about the goodie bag?
all their souvenirs.
Yeah, yeah, the goodie bag.
All that was all part of the show, and it was humiliation. So I'm not going to. Hamas is Hamas, and they're going to do what they're going to do as long as they're allowed to get it with. But to have the Red Cross, the United States pays a quarter of the entire budget of the International Committee of the Red Cross. The American Red Cross is a very important part of that framework. I haven't heard anybody say, "What are we doing up there? Why are people that we support being part of this Hamas humiliation theater?" So that's something I think that needs a lot more attention. That's what we should be focusing on. We're not going to change Hamas. They're going to do their thing. They have to be defeated. But when you have the United Nations, then you have the Red Cross, and you have groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, all being part of the Hamas theater and cheering section, that needs to be part of what we have to deal with.
So where do you see this going? Oh, we're eventually going to get all the hostages out. I mean, that's what Hamas is being sustained by the fact that there are still hostages, correct?
Well, I learned in graduate school, even before that, that maybe you can do some history and get some of it right. To predict the future is very hard to do. This is probably the most uncertain period that we've had since, let's say, 3 months after we went into Gaza, 3 months after the October 7th atrocities, and then the Israeli army went full into Gaza. It was relatively predictable. Yeah, there was friction with Biden, with Blinken in the United States, and don't and call it a win, and what would Hezbollah do? But a lot of the steps that were taken were ones that the Israeli government and Prime Minister Netanyahu said, this is what we're going to do. Maybe not in the same time frame as he wanted to do, but that was what was done. Now we're in a very different phase. And we've got this very shaky ceasefire in with Lebanon, with Hezbollah. It was supposed to be 60 days. Israel was supposed to withdraw, and the Lebanese army was supposed to deploy its forces and remove Hezbollah. Well, that certainly didn't happen. Now
No.
what happens? And there's more uncertainty. I think the Israeli military remains the most dominant in the region, in the whole area. I think that if there's political support, and that depends very much on the Trump administration, then Israel will be able to make sure that our vital interests, including getting the hostages back, are met. But there's a lot of question, a lot of pressure on that.
So how do you? Okay, so Israel's going to stay up in the north and provide the security for all the people who fled. Um, I mean, they're not coming back until they're assured that they can come
That's
back.
right.
And that, so how's that going to happen?
There are lots of, I don't know if I call them rumors or plans. It's a very uncertain realm. There are plans and reports that Israel will be able to maintain, I think, 5 or 6 strong military strong points
Yes.
in the area along the border. And they will be able to make sure that we don't go back to the building of tunnels and the amassing of weapons, at least in that area, so that the people on the border will be able to go back. In this sense, I'm relatively optimistic. And again, I don't, you may look at this in 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years and say, boy, was he off. I won't watch it when I'm wrong. But Israel really, in some ways more than Hamas, Israel really hit Hezbollah hard. And not only that, But things are changing in Syria, have changed.
Oh, totally, totally.
We don't
And
know
in
where
Lebanon,
that,
and in
well,
Lebanon with
Lebanon,
Aoun.
maybe,
Yeah.
maybe.
Well, Aoun seems to be the new prime minister there.
Yeah, but the question is, does he have the ability and the interest in really confronting Hezbollah? We haven't seen it yet. But it will be much harder for Iran, who also, I mean, the Iranians also suffered a pretty strong taste of Israeli capabilities.
Yes.
And there, I think we have the backing of the Trump administration that if the attempt to rearm Hezbollah resumes, that Israel will act militarily. They're much more serious about this. We've learned that in 2006, when we signed this great agreement that Hezbollah was going to withdraw UN Security Council Resolution 1701. I believe Tzipi Livni was the foreign minister at the time. Ehud Olmert was the prime minister. And Europeans came and they all lined up and they said, we are going to make sure that Hezbollah is disarmed up to 40 kilometers, all that stuff. Well, that
The
never
Tani
happened.
River, the whole business, right?
Exactly. That was one big fiction. It took 18 years for us to act on that, and that was because Hezbollah got into the war and that we decided that this is time to deal with that. But they kept arming and arming and arming. It's going to be very hard to restore that. So in that sense, I'm optimistic. It's a We have to play this piece by piece. Hamas is weaker also not only because of what they suffered, but also because they don't have Hezbollah as a backup. They don't have the ability to get much from Iran.
Right,
So
exactly. They don't. They're not. They can't be rearmed. And I'm hearing that there are a number of people who would like to see Trump and Israel go ahead and just hit Iran now because their defensive shield has been destroyed by Israel. Go in there and knock out those nuclear plans. They don't have a weapon yet, but knock out that whole infrastructure there so they don't develop a weapon.
I am waiting to see what happens with the Trump administration because I think there's some strong divisions there, different indications. Trump's a deal maker. He wants a deal. He says, and there's some consistency, as much as you get in these situations, and with Trump, that he wants a Nobel Peace Prize, right? He wants all these wars to be settled so America
Exactly.
can become prosperous and great again and not be spending a lot of money in Ukraine, in support of Israel, in other places around the world. So he's not a big fan, from what we can hear, of going out and hitting Iran. He wants Iran to somehow reach a settlement, and that's kind of dangerous. They'll say all the right words. Oh, sure, we'll talk, we'll stretch it out again like we've done for 20 years. So I'm cautious about that. I don't know. I don't see the Israeli government. I don't see Prime Minister Netanyahu defying or going against what Trump wants. That's pretty dangerous. And that's a
Right,
reality.
right. Well, now that now if there's ever a time, now's the time to do it till they develop their defensive shield again. But I also heard that they were hoping to have Iranians themselves, rise up and do something. That's a little far fetched, but maybe not. I don't know. What do you see?
Well, I've been watching and somewhat involved, at least in some discussions about Iran's internal politics since, let's say, the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. So that's 45 years more or less. I went to a number of briefings from Israeli officials, from American officials about regime change in Iran, all the way through from the Reagan period, all the way through at each different time and administration, both here and there. There was a lot of optimism. There were various times when there was a major demonstrations and protests in Iran. Nothing happened. You can't really predict those sorts of things. You can't predict internal revolutions when things change. So it's certainly not something we should count on.
What about the situation with the uh, Saudi Arabia? That was
Boy,
a
this complicated all this stuff that I have
yeah.
to deal
Well,
with.
that's what started this whole thing, right? They
Oh,
wanted
I
to.
don't think so. I don't buy that. I think
Oh,
October 7th, that Hamas was going to do October 7th. They've been preparing it for 10 something years, and they were going to do it when they were ready for other reasons. And
okay.
the excuse that it had to do with Saudi Arabia, I don't see any evidence of that. I'm not buying that.
Okay, okay, okay.
But
Well, but it's interesting that at least the whatchamacallit, the accords, that were
Abraham Accords.
right,
Abraham Accords.
Abraham Accord, that's still in place.
Yeah,
That did not
that
unravel. Egypt
not at all.
and Jordan, the peace treaties have held during this whole situation.
That's right. Yeah.
That's good.
Yep.
Yes.
I think partly because Israel showed how strong it is. If we would have looked weak, we would have been in a much weaker position. Also, the countries in the Abraham Accords, particularly in the Gulf, the UAE, you still see their planes. They're flying all the way through the war most of the time. Air Dubai and others. In Bahrain, they don't want to have the Muslim Brotherhood. That's Hamas, it's Muslim Brotherhood. They're based in Egypt. They were, and they have this. It's not jihadists, but Islamists. And Qatar is their main sponsor. And the other countries in the region, that's the last thing they want. I have academic counterparts, semi-colleagues in the UAE. And the thing they're most afraid of is a takeover by these crazies, these Muslim Brotherhood crazies that will destroy their lives. So I think that there is good glue in holding this together. And the Saudi leadership, and a lot of the young people, from what I understand, what I can see here and there, are very much interested in being part of that. So you're right. That's a very important um, success that this survived without any real sign of problems for the last 15 months.
So do you see an effort by Trump and I'm not sure who he's going to do it, but maybe Trump, somebody in this administration to try to hammer out a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia and and expand on the Abraham Accords?
I think that's definitely high on the agenda. That's another reason that Trump doesn't want, he wants to see an end to the wars, because until there's an end to the wars, then you can't go to that next stage.
And you don't get a Nobel Prize.
And you don't get the Nobel Prize. Well, he wants a Nobel Prize also for Ukraine, so he's got two things going. But I think he'll take one, yeah. His first phone call to a foreign leader was to Mohammed bin Salman, the leader of Saudi Arabia, the guy who's in charge
Yes,
there.
yes.
So, and he wants to go to Saudi Arabia.
Again,
And he wants, yeah, and he wants to do, that's right. And he wants to do a deal, right?
yep,
And that's a deal. He also
that's right.
wants Saudi investment, which is very clear. So there's a
Yes.
whole package. And I think the Saudi, again, that part of the Saudi leadership, as long as they stay in control, and the young people, they're building all these new cities and investing a lot in trying to become westernized in the slick entertainment element of that particular. How much it goes to politics, we can question that. Having a peace framework with Israel is part of that. The question is, what's the price? And I think there where we really have a problem. No Israeli conceivable government, no majority of Israelis will agree to a Palestinian state after what we've seen. And whatever Palestinians do, whatever territory they get, they use to attack us. We've talked about Hamas, we've talked about Hezbollah and Iran, and we haven't talked about the Houthis, but they've been quiet for a week. What's going on now is a mini war in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria. There are thousands of soldiers going piece by piece because in the same thing that happened in Gaza since the Hamas takeover in 2007 has started happening in the West Bank in the last 4 or 5 years.
We're
And
talking
they've
about
got,
Israeli soldiers.
well,
Israeli
Israeli
soldiers
soldiers are
in the
fighting
West Bank. Yes,
because all these different Palestinian terror groups, I
yes.
think they're like Palestinian Islamic Jihad and of course Hamas, and they're armed by Iran. And yesterday there was a study that was published that said that they are now they've tested and they're developing these little quadcopters you can buy. You put weapons on them and they drop on you. And they tested two of those already against Israeli towns. And they have a rocket-propelled grenade launcher that they showed that was recently captured. So Israel can't afford to allow them to become the new Gaza attack zone. Can't make that into an independent Palestinian state. And the Saudis kept saying, no, we got to have a Palestinian state. Maybe there has to be a horizon. Maybe there's some language. But I think that Ron Dermer, in his public statement in the Knesset the other day, said that's just not going to happen. And there's no commitment to that. Now, negotiations, things change. But it will be very hard, certainly for Netanyahu and I think any other leader, to, in the next five for the foreseeable future, to agree. So I don't know where
Right.
we stand, what the Saudis will accept,
Because
how much.
that's what they said, we'll make a peace with Israel, but you have to have a Palestinian state. So that
So how
was
much
their,
cover they need is the
right.
question. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And so, meantime, what happens in Gaza? Does Hamas stay in Gaza?
That's also one of those crystal ball questions. Hamas is still in Gaza. In a lot of ways, Hamas is deeply embedded with the population and vice versa. You know, the thousands of people of Palestinian Arabs who stormed across the border, it was led by Hamas, but there were people who just joined in the killing and the looting and the everything else that went on. Those were what we would call civilians. So Hamas hasn't lost its grip on Gaza. And even if they did, look, if you look at the history of the Palestinian, what they call the Palestinian movement since 1948, there have been different leaders with different philosophies and different attitudes. Of course, we had Arafat for the 60s, 70s, 80s. You know, for 40 years, Arafat ran the show. And when he went and his faction became weaker, Hamas took over. So you have different rounds, different waves coming through, but the Palestinian society in general still sees itself as destroying Israel and going back to 1948, the pre before Israel existed. That's still the dominant, and it's of course reinforced by UNRWA, by all these NGOs, everything the UN does, and all their cheerleaders in the academic world. So it's Hamas will continue to be a force, and even if they don't, if you change the names, we don't have an answer. Israel doesn't have an answer for Gaza. It's interesting when Trump said that some of the people in Gaza, so that they can rebuild, should leave and go to Egypt and Jordan. Immediately, the Jordanians said, no, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. Egypt's got, I don't know, a population of what, 90 million, and it won't make any difference. But they don't want these Muslim Brotherhood people there who are going to blow things up and take over. And the Jordanians remember September 1970 when the PLO tried to take over Jordan. I'm telling you all the problems because I don't see an easy solution. I think it'll be very, very um, flexible, fluid, and unstable. Right now, the Israeli military is still the only power that's there versus Hamas. They're talking about maybe having some sort of international group that will control Gaza, maybe bring back the Palestinian Authority and Abbas. I, those may be band-aids. They're not serious structures, governmental structures. So it's going to be chaotic.
Yeah, you don't see the PA going into taking over Hamas, taking over Gaza Strip. That's
If
not
they do, you know, they took over Gaza when Israel withdrew in 2005, and then in 2007 they were thrown out. They were thrown off of roofs of
roofs. That's
buildings.
right.
Yep.
That's right. That's right.
And I don't see them having the ability to avoid doing that a second time. They may have some symbolic role.
There are those who speculate that Israel will soon be annexing the West Bank, and that Trump uh, would go with along with it. I mean, Miriam Adelson, the big philanthropist who's a big supporter of Trump, she would love that as well. Do you see that happening?
You know, if you would have asked me that 2 or 3 years ago, I would have said absolutely not, because there are, again, we don't know the exact numbers, but there are a few million Palestinian Arabs hostile to Israel. They become, if Israel annexes the West Bank, what happens? What are they? They become Israeli citizens? Do they live under non-citizens under Israeli control? How does that going to work? And I would have said that was my sort of stump speech X number 4 or 5 years ago. And then after what we saw in October and what happened in Gaza, the other half of it is how do you relinquish territory and then know that it's going to be used instantly as a base to try to wipe you off the face of the earth? And again, that's something that's going to have to be, I think, dealt with fluid. My guess is that what exists now will continue to exist for a foreseeable future. This kind of Swiss cheese map, the Palestinian Authority controls the cities. Israel goes in periodically and cleans it out. They're talking about taking down, deconstructing the refugee camps where a lot of the terrorist activity takes place. In Jenin, in some of the other Tulkarm today was on was the focus of a IDF action, uh, and that may be something that will be part of Israeli policy, where at least you don't have these areas where you can't see from the outside what's going on. These very tightly built old areas of, as I said, in Jenin and in Roma and various other cities that the Palestinians control across the areas of Judea and Samaria. Hebron is another one. So the Palestinian population will still be there. They'll still be governed by their quasi-government, but there will be less ability to produce terror weapons and prepare for attacks like we saw on October 7th. It's going to be back and forth.
Many, many years ago, when I was in Israel, the Palestinians and Israelis were talking about getting together. I remember I was supposed to go with Israel. Israeli military was going to take me into Gaza, and everything was looked hunky dory, right? And the people were talking to each other, and it looked like a panacea. And then I got a call a day before I was supposed to go into Gaza, and from the military, we're not going to do it. And that was the end. But at one point, it really looked great. It really did. Wishful thinking, I guess.
Yeah, and also very, I think, clever, intelligent strategy by the Palestinians. Let's fake it until we're
Yeah.
ready. So Hamas never attacked Israel with the force of October 7th. They let Israel believe that they were deterred. They did little things here and there. And then October 7th, we see this enormous attack, the scale of that attack, and how we didn't know that was coming. And that's will haunt Israel for
Yes.
decades.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
Yes.
we
Yeah.
have to be much more careful, much less confident and arrogant that we can control the situation.
Well, listen, I appreciate it. Gerald Steinberg, thank you so much for joining us this half hour. My name is Stewart Ain. Until next week, have a good one.